Thank you everyone for being here, and thanks for the invitation to speak. So I've been back in France for about a year, so I haven't been formally part of CNN, but it's very close to my interests. I was going to say my heart. Trying to have work-life balance as well. So I'm now based at ENS in Paris, in the geosciences department, in the geology lab. And I lead a project called the Solution for Sustainable and Healthy Food Systems, GLORA, which is funded by the European Research Council. And so I'll present this work, which is from before the project started, but is really something that we're building on in the project, so very relevant. So this is the structure, and I want to thank my co-authors. Some of you might know Jin Feng, worked on Orchidea at LSE. So he provided some very important data on grassland for this paper. So the motivation is, you all know that, I guess here, is that the current global agriculture is unsustainable due to different pressure on the environment. It's using a significant amount of land. It's also the largest consumer of water resources. 90% of water use is for irrigation, water consumption is for irrigation. It also impacts water quality with fertilizer and pesticide pollution. And it is responsible for the food system in general is up to 30% of greenhouse gas emissions. So another point of my research, but I won't go too much in detail in the presentation today, is trade. So we know that those impacts of food production are very variable, depending on the location, depending on the practice, on the resources availability locally, because you can use a lot of water in one place without much stress, because if the water resources are abundant, but then you can use a bit less somewhere else, but it's much worse for the local environment because there's less water. And similarly, the ecosystems can be more or less vulnerable depending on where the food is being produced. So that's why it's interesting to look at trade, because there is potentially an opportunity to reduce the overall impact if we sort of optimize it to minimize the overall environmental pressure. And also it's been growing in the recent decades, so it's increasingly important to consider that. And just an example I'm showing, so I won't go in detail, but just showing a couple of slides on it. So we look at one of the impacts, which is groundwater depletion due to irrigation of crops. So for that, we estimate this groundwater depletion content. So how much liters of groundwater are being depleted per each unit of crop produce, and then we combine this with international trade data. To look at those flows. So between countries, the volume is the amount of groundwater depletion in the food exported. For example, the USA is those kind of blue, purple ribbons, is the US exports of food that relies on overexploitation of aquifers. We also found, whoops, sorry, I don't want to increase this. It might disappear, okay. We see that Pakistan in the bottom is a big exporter, and this is rice actually irrigated with stressed aquifers. So that was a parenthesis. So going back to the main study, we want to look at those key stressors. So on land, on water, on both climate and water quality with fertilizer, and on climate change with the emissions. And we want to evaluate them as consistently as possible in order to then look at their relationships, if there is a trade-off or a synergy. So we just have the example. We talked a lot already about synergy and trade-off. One was this, adaptation to climate change. You need more fertilizer, then it's so you improve your yield, but then you have because of higher fertilizer, you have higher problems of water quality and emissions of greenhouse gas. So you see here. One of the emissions is due to the nitrogen input, and this is N2O. And you have the other gases. And we look also at crops and livestock. So there is a lot of those estimates around the literature. So what we are trying to improve is first to have a global coverage not just one region, because we want to be able also to look at trade in any country. It's very rare that a country only is self-sufficient. So we want to have this coverage with a high resolution, and have those stressors as consistently as possible. So we have the same input data whenever the variables are the same. Think about the interlinkages, for example, the feed that the livestock are consuming are coming from those cropland and grassland system. We take into account the manure that is on grassland, all of those linkages. Also, we have a wide range of products. So we have crops and livestock, almost all of the calories. And also we look at something a bit new, which is not only, so far there's no trade except for feed, because we consider that the livestock feed is coming from local grassland, more or less, but anything that is a crop, so feed crops like soybean, we consider where they are from, because then they will have a different footprints of water or fertilizer. Okay. So this is quite simple equations where we call it intensity. So it's per unit of crop product. So here we show in tons. So you have the hectare used, the water, volume of water used, weight of fertilizer applied, and finally tons of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gas emissions. So every time we divide by the production to get it per unit ton. And also we look at different units. We look at calories, we look at gram of protein and other variables to see how it changes the results. And like I said, we also look at the feed intake of animals, and we assume and we consider the trade. So we have this feed origin in where we calculate this land intensity or all the different intensities. So X is for either land, water, fertilizer. And then we have this feed intake for different ingredients, different animal products, and we get the footprint of the feed. And then we add to that the on-farm emissions and also the on-farm nitrogen emissions because of the manure left on pasture. So so it relies on a lot of work from other groups that have worked in the past, which is the symbol of this. And one of them was mentioned before. So you have the crop calendars data, the crop harvested area, the input of fertilizer, the livestock database and model to have the productivity of the animals, the livestock system maps, etc., etc. And we try to link for all the different crops those data sets. So for example, the livestock productivity and the feed are used both for the grazing estimates. So what did we find? So here we see global averages. So it's from high resolution, you will see after. But this is just global averages. I should add actually the variability around that average. But you have 4 panels, so the land, surface water, nitrogen, and greenhouse gas emission per unit of calories of each product. There is the livestock on top and the crops in the bottom. And also here it's hidden, but you can see the red line from the bottom to the top is showing that usually the most intensive crop is still less intensive than the least intensive animal-based product. So it's a typical thing we know. But also what is interesting is the order of those intensities is changing depending on what you're looking at. So beef obviously comes up very high for the emission intensity, but it's not the highest for other things like nitrogen or surface water. Even though it's still quite high, but I must say beef is great. But just mentioning that, yeah, the difference is quite important. So there's potentially some trade-offs to look at. Also for the land use, I distinguish grassland, which usually takes much more space from cropland in the livestock on the top. So all the green is grassland, but you can still see that it's higher than just crops. So then for a given product, there is also a lot of variability. So I showed before the average, but now I'm showing you a bit the maps, even if it's a bit small, but you can see that the areas are different as well. There is a high variability even for one stressor and one product. So for example, you know, groundwater obviously is localized in some places. The phosphorus input is very different per unit produced unit product. And the kind of hotspots are also in different areas. So in this case of wheat, you can see quite a lot of hotspots in Asia, like China and India. But if you look at greenhouse gas emissions, it's not so high. Then we want to look, I don't have a timer, so I hope just fast enough. Second point is this feed trade. So we say, okay, instead of assuming that all the feed is from the same country as the livestock, we consider the trade of feed. But how much, what difference does that make? And it does make a difference in quite a lot of cases. So for example, here, this is beef intensities, so land, rainwater, nitrogen, phosphorus intensity of beef for the top 10 producers of beef in the world. So you have the different countries there. And for example, if we look at phosphorus, in terms of weight, of importance of soybean in the feed, it's between 5 and 7%. But when you look at this phosphorus, is up to 30, almost 30% of the phosphorus intensity from imported crops. So the light brown is imported and the dark brown is domestic. So it's disproportionately contributing in this case, for example, to the phosphorus intensity. So it is important to consider, which is nice. We didn't do that for nothing. Another example is interesting because you mentioned soy before, David, in Europe. And what we found is when considering feed imports, so comparing the kind of domestic scenario to the one with feed imports, the land intensity of milk in Germany is decreasing because the trade partners have a higher yield. But for surface water, it increased by 27%. And that's because maize and oilseeds that are imported for animal feed in Germany are much more irrigated than in Germany. So it looks a bit like this, no trade. You can see the importance of imported oilseeds for surface water. Oilseed and maize is the yellow one here. Okay, third point, the trade-off and synergies. So the way to read the graph is you have each column is a country, so it's ordered by production. So it's kind of a nice way also to see how concentrated the production is for global maize. So you have US, China, more than half of the world maize are produced in those two countries. And then each row is showing the different intensities. So land, the three waters, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and emissions. And then the other dimension, which is shown in the height of the rectangle and also in the color, it's the same variable, is the level of this intensity. So then when you do the area of the rectangle, you have the total emissions, or the total amount of water. And what we see, just kind of looking at the color, is those very large producers, they tend to have low land intensity, very high yield, very efficient production in terms of land use, but then also higher inputs. So water, irrigation, and fertilizer, and greenhouse gas emission, because in that case, the greenhouse gas emission is mostly due to fertilizer. So you have this trade-off between land and all the others, which is something we know, but nice to see the quantification. And then with rice is different because you have a synergy between land and GHG emissions. So you have relatively low GHG emissions intensity and low land intensity. Obviously, there's higher irrigation because in that case, the emissions for rice is due to methane rather than H2O mostly. And this is increasing with land. It's just correlated with land. And final example for beef, for different reasons, we also have this synergy between being efficient for land and being efficient for GHG, because while obviously there are still more inputs, more fertilizer, more irrigation in those land efficient systems, because the digestion of the ruminant emits more emissions when it's grass-fed than than when we eat crops. So it's kind of a sad fact for environmental activists or whatever, like grass-fed is actually emitting more emissions. So it has a lot of other benefits, animal welfare, maybe biodiversity, calculation, but in terms of emission, grass-fed is worse than crop-fed. So that's the same thing, showing that the higher land intensity system, so with more grassland, they emit more greenhouse gases. Yeah. Oh, I didn't turn them off, so I don't know. Yeah. Does someone know how to do that? Les télés sont. Ah, là, okay, thank you. So quick summary, there is a large variability across products. So there is opportunities to reduce this environmental pressure by changing the diets, as we know, so more plant-based diets, especially in developed regions where we overconsume, for example, red meat and dairy. But even for a given product, there is a large spatial variability with climate, management and practices, local environment. So we can try to reduce also by changing those practices in the systems that are performing worse. And there is the role of international food trade, quite significant in some cases, that affects the intensity of animal products. So we also have to think of that, not just, beef made in France, like where is the food coming from is also important. And finally, we find both synergies and trade-offs. So in the case of synergy, we can reach multiple goals at once, but in the trade-off, we need to, it's difficult actually to rank the different priorities, but we have to think about that and not focus just on one goal to avoid those conflicts. So this is almost submitted, and there is some related work that I'm citing here. And finally, I want to mention the ERC funded project that I'm leading at ENS and the different plans that we have. So one is to have trade to look at the consumption-based estimates of food sustainability. So not just the stressors, but also something on sustainability. As I said in the beginning, like using water in some place doesn't have the same impact as using it in a drier place, for example. Analyze those synergies and trade-off over time. So something also related to what Philippe mentioned about the shock propagation in the trade network. So maybe some collaboration. And finally, evaluate the different solutions for food system sustainability. With this kind of global database, we have a lot of information to work with and to see what are the consequences on different regions, different products. So just an example where we show over time the evolution of carbon footprint from the consumption side, but for the interest of time, I'll just put this. So thanks for your attention.